The black envelope. Ethan Turner's morning started off as usual. He brewed a pot of coffee, glanced at the weather forecast, and shuffled to his front door to grab the newspaper. But when he opened the door, he noticed something unusual. Sitting right on his doorstep was a black envelope. No stamp, no return address, nothing written on it. Just a sleek, dark envelope that stood out against the dull concrete. For a moment, Ethan just stared at it, a mix of curiosity and caution creeping over him. He picked it up, feeling the weight of it in his hand, and carefully slid his finger under the flap. Inside, he found two things: a photograph of a man he didn't recognize and a small slip of paper with a set of coordinates. Ethan sat down at his kitchen table, turning the photograph over in his hands. The man in the picture was middle-aged, with a scruffy beard and eyes that seemed to pierce through the glossy print. There was nothing written on the back, no hint as to who he was. Ethan pulled out his phone and typed the coordinates into a map app. They pointed to a spot about an hour's drive away, deep in the woods outside of town. He felt a chill run down his spine. Who would send him something like this? And why? It didn't make any sense. But the more he thought about it, the more he felt like he had to find out. Maybe it was the curiosity, or maybe it was just a need for a break from his usual routine. But by the time he finished his coffee, he had made up his mind. He was going to follow the coordinates. The drive took him along winding, empty roads that gradually narrowed the closer he got to the location. Trees lined both sides, thick and dense, blocking out most of the sunlight. Ethan could feel his nerves start to creep up, but he kept driving until the GPS finally said, "You've arrived." He pulled over to the side of the road, staring into the woods. There was no path, no sign of anything unusual, just trees and shadows. He almost turned back, but something compelled him to get out of the car. After a few minutes of pushing through branches and stepping over roots, he noticed a rusted metal door set into the ground, half hidden under layers of leaves and dirt. It looked like the entrance to some sort of underground bunker. Ethan's heart started to pound. This was the kind of thing you'd see in a movie, not in real life. He stood there for a moment, trying to decide if he was about to make a huge mistake. But the photograph and those coordinates were still stuck in his head, and they pushed him forward. With a deep breath, he grabbed the handle and pulled the door open. The air inside was cool and damp, and a set of concrete steps led down into the darkness. Ethan switched on the flashlight on his phone and slowly made his way down. As he descended, the faint smell of rust and mildew filled his nose. At the bottom, he found a long, narrow hallway lined with old, flickering lights that buzzed softly. He walked cautiously, his footsteps echoing in the quiet space. The hallway ended at another door, this one slightly ajar. He nudged it open and stepped inside, finding himself in what looked like a small control room. There were old monitors mounted on the walls, most of them cracked or dark, but a few still flickered with grainy images. On one of the screens, he saw the same man from the photograph standing outside somewhere, as if he was waiting for someone. The image looped, over and over. Ethan's skin prickled. It felt like he was being watched. Even though he hadn't seen another soul since he arrived, he moved closer to the monitors, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. But before he could piece it together, he noticed a notebook lying on a dusty table in the corner. The pages were filled with notes, scribbles, and what looked like sketches of the underground facility. As he flipped through, one sentence stood out, circled in red ink. "He needs to know the truth." Ethan didn't know who he was, but he had a sinking feeling it was him. He kept searching the room, finding more clues, documents, maps, even a set of keys, but nothing that fully explained what this place was or who had brought him here. That's when he heard a faint, rhythmic tapping coming from somewhere down the hall. He hesitated, but then curiosity took over. He followed the sound, which led him to a room at the very end of the hallway. The door was closed, but the tapping was louder now, almost like someone was knocking from the inside. With a shaky hand, Ethan unlocked the door using one of the keys he had found, and slowly pushed it open. Inside, he found a small, dimly lit room. In the center was an old chair, and sitting in that chair was the man from the photograph. He was bound, with his hands tied behind him and his head slumped forward, but he was alive. The tapping had been him trying to signal for help. Ethan rushed over, his mind racing. "Who did this to you?" he asked, as he untied the man's hands. The man's eyes fluttered open, and for a moment, he just stared at Ethan, as if trying to recognize him. Then he said, in a weak, raspy voice, "You shouldn't have come." Before Ethan could ask what he meant, he heard footsteps coming from down the hall, heavy, deliberate footsteps. Getting closer, he looked at the man, panic rising in his chest. "Who's coming?" he whispered, but the man just shook his head. "You need to leave now." Ethan's mind was screaming at him to run, but his legs felt frozen. He glanced back at the doorway, and in the dim light, He could see a shadow stretching across the floor, growing longer as the footsteps approached. Whoever had brought him here had been expecting him all along, and he had walked right into their trap. Without thinking, Ethan grabbed the man's arm, pulling him to his feet. "I'm not leaving without you," he said, his voice shaking, but the man pulled back, his eyes full of fear. "It's too late," he whispered. "They're already here." The last thing Ethan remembered was the sound of the footsteps stopping just outside the door, and a voice, calm and cold, saying, "You were never supposed to find this place." Then everything went dark. Ethan woke up back in his car, parked on the side of the road where he had left it. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the woods, and for a moment, he thought it had all been a dream. But when he glanced at the passenger seat, he saw the black envelope, now empty, lying right where he had left it. The photograph and the slip of paper were gone. He looked around, half expecting to see someone watching him, but the road was deserted. As he drove home, he couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been controlling everything, like he was just a pawn in a game he didn't understand. He didn't know who had sent him the envelope or why, but one thing was clear: whatever he had stumbled upon, it was something he was never meant to see. And now, whoever was behind it knew he had seen it.